talk to you all about OneDrive Sync. I've had OneDrive Sync on my mind for most of the last 7 months because that's what I've been tasked with at my employer, a large insurance firm. So my task has been to deploy the Sync client to 60,000 users globally. And this is not something I'm doing alone. It takes a pretty significantly sized team. We have a project manager, a change manager, a deployment manager, a data analyst, a group policy expert, and group policy administrator. Our SCCM team, SCCM is System Center Configuration Manager, again, that Microsoft tool that is used to push applications out to laptops and desktops. We've been working with a fast track engineer. We've been working with our networking team to understand the impact of sync traffic on the network. We've been working with our support team to get our service desk ready. We've been working with our Citrix team because they want to have OneDrive in their VDI environments. We've been working with our Jamf lead. Jamf is a tool similar to SCCM for pushing applications out to Macs. We've been working with this a big group of people to make this possible. And so I want to share with you some of the things I've learned from that from this project so far. First of all, let's start with the basics. What is OneDrive? OneDrive is a place for your stuff, or it is a place for your personal work files. I think it's very important to differentiate OneDrive from SharePoint. SharePoint is a great place to store documents for your team, your project, your department. OneDrive is a place for your personal work files. That is important because the life cycle of a OneDrive is the life cycle of the employee. When the employee leaves the organization, that person's OneDrive goes away. So that's OneDrive. OneDrive is Microsoft's cloud storage offering for individuals. And OneDrive Sync is the sync client that takes that and does really 4 different sync experiences. First of all, you have syncing of OneDrive in 2 scenarios and then SharePoint in 2 scenarios. So the same sync client syncs content from your OneDrive for Business to a folder on your local machine, or really anything in that folder and below. You can also have OneDrive sync your personal consumer OneDrive to a folder on your machine. In our enterprise environment, for security reasons, we block that. You can also use OneDrive to sync SharePoint libraries, and so those will show up again in a folder, and all these folders are in your user profile. So that's what I mean by user's username. That's your user profile directory on your local machine. And when you sync a SharePoint library, it creates a folder named after the company name, or really the name of your Office 365 tenant, and syncs your SharePoint folders there. Now, if you're syncing SharePoint folders from another tenant, another organization, whether it's a partner, a client, or vendor, for common scenarios, then you'll see that company name show up as a folder in user profile. So Sync handles all 4 of these scenarios, and that's what the Sync tool does. So before we go further, I want to talk a little bit about licensing, because licensing is just a little bit weird. You would expect the licensing for OneDrive to be a OneDrive license. It's not. It's the SharePoint license. There's historical reasons for that, but what it means is that access to Sync is controlled by the SharePoint license, but access to SharePoint is not. A user can go visit a SharePoint site and it doesn't do a license check. In order to sign into the OneDrive Sync client, they have to have their SharePoint license. So what that SharePoint license entitles them to varies based on which Office subscription they have or which Office license they have. So I'm going to look at 4 of the common licenses. You've got the E1 license, the E3 and E5 licenses, which have the same benefits, and the F1 license. And these are all enterprise licenses. There's, of course, other license options out there. But E1 gives you 1 terabyte of storage, and this gives you the sync experience. E3 and E5 give you 1 terabyte of storage or more. So the default starts out as 1 terabyte of storage per user. But should a user need more space than that, you can give them virtually unlimited storage, and basically you can increase the storage up to 25 terabytes with a support request. Microsoft will also issue additional entire site collections for that user, giving them as much storage as they need. And then, of course, you get the sync experience with that. For the F1 license, this is the first line worker license. You only get 2 gig of cloud storage, and you do not get the sync experience. The rationale for that is that first line workers are mobile first workers. They're not sitting at a desktop. So they're using a phone, not a desktop. For a phone, you have the OneDrive mobile app, but that's not a sync experience. The sync experience is really designed and intended for laptop scenarios. And so since first line workers aren't expected to have laptops, they don't get the ability to use OneDrive Sync.
I would just point out other examples of first line workers that might not be always on a phone are in retail and healthcare. So they're using shared computers, so they would access their OneDrive in a web browser experience on a shared computer.
So another thing that's different about OneDrive when you're thinking about it from a deployment perspective is that it's not just about landing the bits on the machine. You want the user to sign in. And so there's really 3 things that need to happen when you deliver OneDrive Sync Client to a user. You want them to log in, which is when the license check I just talked about happens. You want them to go through the tutorial so they get some understanding of what OneDrive is and why they want to use it. And then in an enterprise scenario, there's this capability called KFM that is really useful, and we want that to start and run. You may be asking, what on earth is KFM? KFM is known folder move. Known folder move is also called PC backup, and what it does is it relocates desktop documents and pictures from where it usually sits on the user's machine into their OneDrive sync folder so that those files get synced. So everything that they already have on the desktop in documents folder, in their pictures folder, will start syncing because those folders have been moved into the OneDrive sync folder. Those 3 folders, we call them known folders. So you can think of them as Windows special folders, but they're not the only Windows special folders on a laptop. And if you look in Windows File Explorer and look at this computer, you'll see a number of special folders there. And the ones that are not part of KFM are the 3D Objects folder, downloads, music, videos, and favorites. At my employer, we had initially tried to include those in our sync, but in order to do that, we were using group policies that only worked during login when you're connected to the network. And so that did not work for VPN users, and so we backed off from doing that. Plus, Microsoft does not recommend those. Downloads is not recommended because that's temporary stuff anyway. That's stuff that you got off the internet, and you can get off the internet again. Music and videos tend to be larger files, and although some departments might have a use for those, the departments have a use for those media tend to have those as corporate assets, which should go in a SharePoint site, not an individual user site. And then favorites, if you sign into your browser, those are already taken care of.
Yeah, I was going to say is the favorite special folder has really been superseded by the native syncing capabilities of popular browsers. So the Chromium-based Edge has a mechanism to synchronize favorites, Chrome, Firefox, etc. So there's that's a folder of declining use.
So as I said, KFM relocates these. It pushes them one level deeper. So visually, here's where they're located under the hood. Most users don't actually notice that these are in those locations because of the shortcuts that are available. And so they start out here, and then they get moved within the OneDrive folder, and the OneDrive folder will be named OneDrive dash whatever company name is. So if it's Contoso, it's OneDrive dash Contoso. Now, if you have any applications that are hard-coded to those specific paths, that could cause you an issue. We haven't found any of those yet, fortunately, in our organization.
I was going to point out in terms of folder names at the application level, Michael, used the term about the Windows special folders. For each one of these folders, there is a placeholder name that applications should use. It's preceded with a percent sign, and then it would say desktop, and then it ends with a percent sign. And the Windows operating system will automatically substitute the new locations for the old ones.
And when these locations change, your desktop shortcuts for those get updated as well. So in the left navigation, you'll see the shortcuts for those are in File Explorer. This is the File Explorer experience. When you click on my computer or this computer, you'll see those shortcuts, and those shortcuts will continue pointing to where they should point, which is they get updated to as part of this transition. Another big thing for us when we were using KFM was support for OneNote. So OneNote notebooks, you can have, depending on what version of which OneNote desktop application you're using, whether you're using OneNote 2016 or OneNote for Windows 10. OneNote 2016 has the ability to create local notebooks. OneNote for Windows 10 does not. And so OneNote 2016 was part of your Office 2016 deployment, and so everybody has it. And if they've used it, that means they also have at least one local notebook. Now, when OneDrive and that local notebook was stored in My Documents. So when OneDrive kicks in and tries to do known folder move, it's going to upload that notebook. Well, before 19.202 version of OneDrive, it didn't know how to convert that notebook from the desktop format to the online format because the two are actually different. And so it would flag that as an error and ask the user to go into OneNote and move it, which was a multi-step process and therefore a big friction point and unpleasant. So starting with version 19.202, and then that was released to production as 19.222, that feature is there, and it's a seamless, it moves those seamlessly, and the user doesn't have to do anything. And when it moves those up, it replaces those with a shortcut. So you'll see the icon change, and the experience changes, but the file is still there where they expected it, at least in desktop, even though desktop is moved. So it's a little bit different place, but it's still there. It's been converted. It's been turned into a shortcut, and now it works online and in the desktop apps. So another piece of the OneDrive deployment is the update channels. So separate from Office, separate from Windows, separate from continuous updates in the cloud, the OneDrive Sync client uses 3 update channels. The insider ring can be updated as often as every 3 days. The production ring can be updated as often as every 2 weeks, and then they offer the enterprise ring, which only updates on average about every 2 months. However, if you're trying to take control of the update process, and you roll out a version of OneDrive Sync with SCCM, if you don't push a new version every 2 months, it will try to auto-update. And in order for that to work, there's certain couple of URLs that it has to be allowed to access through your firewall. And if those URLs are closed, it will also hamper other functionality of the client. So if you're deploying every 2 months, that's great. If you're not, deploy once and let it auto-update. Enterprise ring, it'll update every 2 months on average. So if you want to know what version is rolling out now, the version let's start with what version you have on the machine. So if you go to the settings, if you right-click on the cloud in the system tray and go to settings, you'll get to the settings dialog for OneDrive, and on the About tab, you have the version number, and it's not just a text, but it's actually a link. And that link takes you to the change history page, which shows you what version is Insider Ring, what version is in production, what version is Enterprise. And you can also see when the changeover in versions for Enterprise is going to happen. So because we needed the 2.2.2 version in order to have the OneNote functionality, we had some of our first users on the Insider Ring. Again, something we controlled with group policies. Once 222 made it to production, we changed our group policies to have people in the production ring so that we get fewer updates. And then after March 11th, we'll be able to change the update ring to enterprise, and that'll be our standard going forward. So, pushing out OneDrive to a bunch of people, how do we know we're successful? Well, it's more than just about landing the bits on the machine. As I said before, it's really about getting them to go through the first run experience and getting that laptop protected. But it's also about people understanding the benefits of OneDrive, and it's really about two behavior changes. And that's where OCM comes into play. And the two behavior changes for OneDrive that I see as most critical are getting people to understand the benefits of storing stuff in synced folders on their laptop instead of plain unsynced local folders, and understanding the value of sharing links rather than attachments in email. And of course, the second one is true for SharePoint as well, and also helping them understand that when they sync folders, especially SharePoint's folders, it makes that content so much easier to manage because they have the local file explorer user experience. So it turns out reporting on some of that isn't as easy as you would like. Let's take a look at what the reports are. So in Office 365, the admin site, you can get a usage analytics report, and at the top level, what you see is this guy over here. And that shows you, oh look, we've got 6 million files, and that's been increasing, and we've got some number of active users. This active user count is the users have to have their SharePoint license for them to be considered an active user. And they also need to be actually doing some activity, whether viewing or editing a file that's stored in OneDrive, syncing files, sharing internally or sharing externally. Again, in our environment, we prohibit sharing externally in OneDrive. We say if you're going to share externally, we have special SharePoint sites that are specially configured for that, and we have a special security model for that. So for us, it's good to see shared externally at 0. And what we're looking for is an increase in sync activity and the number of users doing sync activity after we've rolled out to them. But that's not really adoption, that's deployment success, because again, we're kicking off KFM, known folder move on their machine, so they're going to be syncing something right away. And in fact, because there's that initial sync, it's possible that we'll see spikes and then leveling off, because there'll be a lot of files to sync up front if they've had a lot of stuff on their desktop, but after that, it'll only sync when things change. And that could be just a few files here and there, at least on a per-day basis. So you have some of these metrics, but what you don't have is you don't have any way to tell when KFM ran successfully on a user machine. And so that is coming soon. They previewed improved sync reports at Microsoft Ignite last year, put out a sign up for a preview program for that. But it looks like they won't deliver it until later this year, which for us, we can't wait to get our hands on these. We want those sync reports. Again, being able to see, did all 3 folders sync successfully? Is KFM working? Is that machine protected? For us, that's a critical milestone in order for that machine to be ready to be upgraded from Windows 7 to Windows 10. So, looking back here, there's just sort of a laundry list of things that made this hard. And so I'm just going to go through these one at a time. Regulatory approvals. When we're looking at a global enterprise, there are different data residency rules around that different countries have. There are different approval processes. Germany has its Workers' Council that has to approve before we can deploy something to them. So we're still waiting for that to go through. So at the moment, we're not deploying to Germany. China has its own data residency, and for China, if you want to comply with that, you actually have to run a whole separate tenant, which you get from 21 ViaNet rather than Microsoft directly. And so that is a whole level of management overhead. It's not just about spinning up a new geography for your OneDrive data. It's actually an entire separate tenant, not just for OneDrive, but the entire Office tenancy. So that's a significant overhead. And then the Android mobile app for OneDrive apparently is not approved for use in China. As I said, we had firewall issues where we had to make sure that there were 2 URLs that could be gotten to through the firewall. And before that was working, what we saw was that the backup tab on the settings dialog box disappeared because it wasn't able to get the configuration file to show it. There's another thing to be aware of, and so yeah, that's what I'm talking about here. Okay, so there's another thing to be aware of in terms of how Microsoft can continue to control the configuration of the client even without changing the version. So on the back end, they have something called feature ramping, and they do this when things are in the insider ring, where they were experimenting. We saw this when they were experimenting with a new look and feel for that first run tutorial. And so we were going through and we're doing some user documentation instructions on how to set up OneDrive the first time as a deployment guide. We noticed that the graphics on that tutorial changed, and then later they changed back. But what was happening on the back end was, even though we were on one version, Microsoft was turning on the new and old, turning on or off the new user experience as they were testing it out and getting feedback on it. So that tripped us our documentation. But then we were able to confirm with them that they had fully deployed that, and so it would be consistent going forward.
Yeah, that process of the changing of which functionality is available internally at Microsoft, we call that flighting. And we use that technique with all of the desktop clients. So it's something to be aware of, especially if you're trying to prepare documentation or take screenshots or whatnot for user education. Is when you're on these insider builds, sometimes we'll turn things on and off based on if we get telemetry that something's not working right, or users are having problems with it or something like that.
So as I talked about the OneNote issues we had, because when we started our test deployments, our proof of concepts, our small group testing, that was before 19202, and so we're getting people having issues with local OneNote notebooks. Reporting on those was also a challenge. We had no idea how much OneNote is in our organization, so we actually had to use a third-party tool called Tenant Names to pull registry entries from user computers to see how many people had OneNote notebooks with paths that were C:, something. We had legacy group policies that were interfering with known folder move. So known folder move will only work when it can do that redirection. And if you already have policies that redirect those folders, then it will throw an error and say your IT department has policies that block this. Please contact your IT administrator. We were working with 3 operating systems: Windows 7, Windows 10, 1703, Windows 1803. We did testing across all 3 of them. Key differentiator between 1703 and 1803 is that files on demand wasn't available in 1703, so it was more like the Windows 7 experience, but of course the UI was Windows 10, so there were different screenshots for all 3. As we've gotten closer to being able to replace all 1703 machines, we've actually dropped that from our scope. There's previous versions of the sync client out there in some of our standard images, both for Windows 7 and all of our Windows 10 machines. And so we did one test with one of our standard images for Windows 10, and it was running a 2 or 3 year old version of OneDrive, and it didn't auto upgrade right away. So it ran through, failed partway through, and then when you tried it again, that's when it auto upgraded to 19.222 and had the desired experience. But because it didn't upgrade at the beginning, we realized we couldn't trust the in-place version, and so we'd have to do an SCCM deployment to that machine to pull off whatever's there and put a newer version on.
Hey, Michael, I have to take off, so
Okay.
I had a hard stop at 10:30,
Sure.
but very nice to meet everybody here.
Thank you.
And
Thanks for
I'll be
coming.
looking for you guys at some of the other events, okay?
Great.
Yeah, I got to get to another meeting, and nice meeting everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Nice to meet you. See you.
So legacy users. In our environment, we came from Office 365 dedicated, and a little over a year ago made a transition from dedicated to multi-tenant. And what that meant was that our OneDrive sites were originally SharePoint My sites, and they all have the shared with everyone folder in them, which is no longer provisioned in modern My sites. So you've got some users, most users with that folder, new users without it. Also, users who were signed before we did a tenant rename have a different OneDrive sync folder path than users who only started using the OneDrive sync after that.
One of the tips to share when it comes to the tenant name is try to keep that name as short and concise as possible, because as you saw in earlier slides, it does add to the length of all of the paths and all of the files. So that can be a problem if you get paths that are too long.
Our tenant was created long before I got there.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
Except
law
for a
firms
law
are a
firm.
common case because you have all of the partners' names, right?
yeah, and it was difficult when we were making transition from Windows 7 to Windows 10.
Yeah.
And using this, and I don't want to take your,
No, go ahead.
but using the known folder redirection was great as part of our Windows 10 rollout because we had user syncing. But law firms are also full of people who dictate governance rules but don't follow them.
That's right.
And so there are this hordes and hordes of folders with long names that do not want to sync.
It's hard to tell one of the partners of the firm that his name doesn't belong in there. Yes.
External licensing drivers. So in our environment, we're trying to use the SharePoint license to control who got OneDrive sync when. And then another project came along that was also using SharePoint and OneDrive for an enterprise content management scenario. And so they needed everyone to have licenses. So for a while, they were pushing out OneDrive licenses, or SharePoint licenses ahead of us. And so we were losing some of the control that way. But what we did was we made sure we got our group policies out to everyone, even if they didn't have the OneDrive client yet. We had to come up with a retention policy. So we worked with our with our global security standards people and established a retention policy of 10 years from last modified date. And then there's going to be some user communication around that because there are some users who have content that has been sitting around for 10 years or more, and when they move it into, or when KFM runs and grabs it from documents and moves it into their OneDrive and syncs up, that retention policy could immediately then move that stuff to the recycle bin. As I said, employee lifecycle, the thing there again is OneDrive will deprovision a user's OneDrive by default 30 days after they disappear from Azure Active Directory. Well, that may not correlate with termination date. What a number of organizations do is they terminate and disable the account, but leave that account there for a certain number of days. So as long as the account is there, even if it's disabled and the user can't sign in, OneDrive doesn't see that it's going away yet. It doesn't see it until it disappears from Azure Active Directory. So that can add 30 days or whatever you configure to the data destruction timeline. one of the fundamental challenges of deploying, whether it's both OneDrive or Office Pro Plus, is the correlation between users and machines. And this is that you deploy to a machine, but you want to communicate with the user who uses that machine. So you need that data of whose machine is this. Reporting on deployment success, talked about that of we don't have a good way to report on did KFM start and finish the first complete sync on this user's machine. So we had to use a third-party tool to pull registry edits to see that. And again, those reports from Microsoft are coming hopefully the first half of this year. Our very first deployment attempt, the SCCM package did not prompt the user to log into OneDrive, so it successfully put OneDrive on their machine, and they didn't notice. And so they never logged in, and we didn't get the results we wanted. On the other hand, once we had deployed our group policies to everyone, there were users who hadn't synced before, or perhaps had logged in and didn't realize it, and suddenly, for various reasons, sync kicks off, and they see their documents, pictures, and desktop move, and it's surprising to them. So that was another scenario that we had to address. We have our store what where policy that had to be changed, which is there were rules about what you can store on your laptop and rules about what you can store in OneDrive or SharePoint, and we had to get the desktop in OneDrive aligned because now they're syncing. So stuff that you don't want in OneDrive, you have to make sure isn't on your laptop. And that also meant that we need to give users time to clean up, so that lengthened deployment cycle for giving that to users. Talked about shared with everyone, talked about folder redirection. In the deployment testing we've been doing, we've also found there's a couple of error situations where the sync client doesn't have a friendly error message. It basically says an error code. And so we've seen a couple of error codes like 0x8000 4005, and we had to go back to Microsoft, open a support ticket, figure out what that meant. In this case, that one in particular meant that they had two OneDrive sites on the back end, and we had to get that cleaned up. Another thing that slowed us down was change freezes. So large enterprise, middle of December to middle of January, the change freezes. So we weren't allowed to deploy anything to more than 5 people a day. And so we did a bunch of test deployments during that time. But when your goal is 60,000 users and you're doing 5 people a day, well, okay, you're testing, but you're not really getting closer to the end goal.
I have a question.
Sure.
Does this impact those? So I've been on a couple of migrations where departments like HR really are very alarmed about the PST files not being synced. So just curious how this might, PST file syncing fits into this.
So the answer is it doesn't. In fact, we block PSTs from syncing explicitly. So they're, let's see. Most of our users should not have PST files. There is the Exchange Online archiving capability if they need to have
That's what an
that.
end user would use. But there might be people who do e-discovery in HR and legal departments.
HR, yeah.
Specifically. But the key thing, like Michael says, is you want to have a block on those files. You want to make sure you educate that audience about special handling for PSTs. They don't belong in OneDrive is the short answer.
Right. But what's the kind of from a user experience point of view? So we were kind of having users open the PSTs, move the individual files out, and then sync them. Is there a better solution from an end user?
It all depends on what the end user is needing to achieve.
Yeah.
So if the end user is needing to achieve historical archived access to individual email messages, then that's a good approach.
Okay.
Or move it to their Exchange Online archive would be the preferred approach. And that's better from a overall maintenance and governance standpoint, because then the back-end administrator can exert control over those. Whereas if it's individual EML or MSG files that are floating around on somebody's hard drive, that's a e-discovery risk.
So if they do go the Exchange Online archive route,
yep.
You said that the backend administrator can help with that. Does that take the onus off of the end user to take action, and can it be done on the backend
It
process?
has to be a coordinated action, so if
Okay.
the user has a PST, they have to work with an administrator to get that reconnected into Outlook and then get the messages moved from the PST file over to the archive file. It's one of those things where an end user is not going to do this every day of the week, so they're
Right.
not going to know how to do it. But an administrator should learn how to do it, and then can help the end user do the work.
Okay.
So it's a high touch, but one time only kind of
Right,
thing.
exactly, yep. And another category of special handling is access databases. It's another kind of common thing. But in general, any file that can be quote unquote open all the time by the application, and the application's constantly writing to the file, is a bad candidate to be in OneDrive. So PSTs and access databases are the two common violators.
And we also blocked .nsf, which is notes databases.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, as we're phasing out PST usage, or we should be, let's say that we have a policy implemented that there's no PSTs from here on out. You can still have your data archived through Exchange Online Archive, or you can open them up and drag over the individual files. But what would be, from the user experience, the best practice going forward for teams like HR, legal compliance, where they really need these, they feel compelled, or they have legal reasons that they must have, maintain these copies for a long period of time?
Yeah, so a shared mailbox, which it itself will have an archive. That's probably the best thing for an HR team to do. Because then that way the mailbox is not tied to any individual in HR, right? Because people come and go also on the HR team. So you would use a shared mailbox.
So when there's an archive, it doesn't create like a PST. It's just a.
It's stored on the Exchange Online service.
Okay.
On the back end. So it's the mechanics of it.
And the data retention
Inside
policy.
the Exchange mail store, it's in the same place as the active mailboxes. It's just a inactive partition that's associated with the main mailbox.
And you can set different data retention policies.
Yeah, you can use what's called MRS, Mail Retention Services policies in Exchange at the folder level.
Mhm.
But now they're changing that from the exchange level to.
Yeah, they're trying to generalize it.
Okay.
In the compliance and security dashboard, you could set the retention policies for
This is a
mail.
good
They're not.
transition if I can. I'm not going to go into that.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
So
With your levers, so you terminate their account straight away and then delete the data after 30 days, or you send it.
So what will happen, when the user account no longer appears in Azure Active Directory, and again, in enterprise solution scenarios, that's usually it's synced from on-premise Active Directory. So once it no longer shows up in Azure Active Directory, the OneDrive service starts a timer, which by default is 30 days. And depending on what options you set, that person's manager may get a notification that they get access for 30 days. In our organization, that was determined that would be a privacy violation, and so we don't notify the manager. But anyone who needs access to a colleague OneDrive, there's a business continuity disaster recovery request form they have to fill out,
Okay.
which goes through all sorts of approval. To your question of,
And how long is the data cut for that
so
policy?
default is 30 days from the point that the profile is
Yeah.
made.
No, but for the business data recovery,
Yeah.
and what have you got it set to? Because one of the biggest issues I see is OneDrive now is so simple to use. People, rather than putting it in Teams or SharePoint, will keep their documents, presentations in OneDrive, even if it's and a month isn't very long. So,
Right.
and people will be collaborating on that in one individual's OneDrive.
Right. Yeah. So,
I was going to say, so that's one of the user education things I think.
right,
that is
and
So that's the store what
important
where.
is
Right,
store what
store what
where,
where.
yes. Educate users that, documents start off as an individual's work, but then gradually they share it with the team, and then it becomes the team's work, is they have to be conscious of the fact that the life cycle stage of that document just changed, and they need to move it to a team site.
Yeah.
So that's where.
It is a difficult concept to get across.
Periodic training or.
OneDrive or SharePoint, what to use when.
It's also just, it's so easy to start off with it in your OneDrive.
Right.
Yeah.
And then to find the time to go and say, hey, now I'm going to be good and move it.
So at least the user experience for that has improved. If you like, in the OneDrive online site, you can select a file and say move, and then pick the SharePoint site that you want it to go to. But again, there's got to be conscious effort.
Yeah, and there isn't there a view that shows a user which files in their OneDrive have been shared out?
So
I know
there
they're
is a
shared
sharing
with
icon.
me. They're shared with me.
Right,
which
and
is-
in File
Boxes.
Explorer, if this file is shared, you'll see
There's a different
a little,
icon.
there's an icon next to the sync status icon.
So if you haven't had it rolled out for that long to get a lot of pushback, I suppose.
No.
And you would just say, well, we had the store what where policy, you should be educated. And I think like a year or two into a OneDrive rollout, that's the biggest challenge.
Well, so I can speak from my personal experience at Microsoft. We've had OneDrive rolled out forever. I really can't think of a scenario where a team collaboration document has disappeared because the user went away. And I'm not saying that we're better or worse than anybody else. I'm just saying in my lived experience, I haven't really encountered that as a problem.
But
the key
the
is,
average user in Microsoft is a lot more technical savvy.
no, you would be surprised. So just
Okay.
It might be
just
that you
keep
felt-
in mind, not everybody's in the product group, right?
Okay.
We have all kinds of, HR professionals, real estate professionals, lawyers, right? We run the gamut of roles.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that I think saves us is that there are processes which trigger the document to be moved to a certain location as part of the process,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So like if you're working together on a proposal for a customer, there's a stage in the process that says, okay, now it has to go for legal review. You have to put it on this site
Yeah.
for legal review, and then from then on, that's the location of record for that document, right? Same thing with HR reviews and personnel reviews and that kind of thing. You can start working on it on your OneDrive, but you're never going to advance all the way to the end of getting your annual review signed off until you move the document to a location where is the storage location of record.
And the other thing, like if you are in an organization that hasn't done the syncing yet, and you haven't introduced OneDrive, where are they saving files now that aren't going
On their local drive.
on their local drive? So then, but in the
It's the same
beauty,
problem
it's
is
the
that
same
guy
problem.
loses
No,
his
but you-
laptop in the cab.
You can't co-author. So if you're marketing or sales and we're working together on a sales opportunity, you have to put it on SharePoint to co-author to work with me.
and you're.
So then it's safe.
OneDrive, you can start
So
authoring
for
it.
sales and marketing people, it's just so easy to co-author on OneDrive. I'm too busy. I don't want to move it up to. And those files are
Yeah.
less regulated. The presentations for today, kind of, is this on your OneDrive?
No, actually, this is on a team site.
Okay.
That
So-
we share.
Because you're
We
working.
collaborate on a team site, yeah.
Okay. I mean, you're well trained.
No, it does come down to user training, I think,
Yeah.
yeah.
But and that's a good point about the co-authoring. I was going to say, in our environment, since previously people were just saving things to their local drive,
Yeah.
and I was a big fan of folder redirection from the Windows 95 days, immediately put this online. And it makes it easier for us as administrators to find files that people have saved someplace and not told anyone, and they've gone on vacation.
Yeah.
But we have greater longevity than your usual company.
I was thinking the other last chance safety net is email winds up being an archive. Because when you're collaborating on those files, you usually wind up sending it as a file attachment somewhere. Now, if people really got good at sending links instead of attachments, and those links point back to a OneDrive, then maybe there's a
And that is-
greater risk.
That is what we're teaching people to do.
Yeah.
And now Outlook's making that so easy. So you don't send email attachments anymore, but you use OneDrive. So unless it's like a proposal or legal,
Right.
you end up with a big risk when people leave.
And I mean, that's an issue that we've seen with the Cisco WebEx Teams client, is that when for their link picker to share a link that leverages OneDrive or SharePoint, it starts out with showing you essentially your OneDrive online, and so it's easier to pick files from OneDrive than it is to navigate deeper using the list of sites on the side. And so you're probably more inclined to share OneDrive links.
Yeah, it's the first location that's offered to grab a file from is your
Right.
OneDrive, not the SharePoint
Right.
site that you're working with a team on. Yeah.
So that's a challenging default in WebEx Teams. And I think that's another example of where the Microsoft Teams user experience is better, because you're encouraged to put it into the SharePoint file store for that team.
I feel like the Office mobile apps though prefer OneDrive. I can think of like a few frustrating moments when I'm trying to find something somewhere on SharePoint, whereas on OneDrive it's there.
Yeah, on mobile, I'm most often, I don't start in the mobile app. I usually start from a link. So I'm either in the team collaboration site, or I'm in an email where somebody sent me a link, and then I click the link to bring the file up in whatever the appropriate mobile app is. Very rarely do I ever go on my phone, Excel file, new, save, and then try and figure out a place to put it. That almost never happens for me in my daily use. But yeah, I agree. When you do that, file save, the first place it suggests is your OneDrive app.
I think this goes back though to just the culture change, right?
Yeah.
Like introducing this whole digital footprint. There is some change, and there is some, items that people, are used to doing it one way, right? And it's easier to grab it from here and share it with everyone. But at the same time, there's that culture change of, providing them, new rules to the game, but also giving them a reason why, right? And having them kind of adapt those changes versus just do it this way without it, a reason behind it.
You had mentioned Citrix.
Yeah.
Are you using FS Logic or something else to manage their profiles?
So I haven't dug into that piece yet. Our Citrix team
It will
was
be
looking
using
at that.
It will be using FS Logic.
Yeah, because Microsoft acquired
I've
FS Logic.
been talking to that team, so I know. Yeah, they will be. Yeah, it's really very difficult not to use to use a profile
Yeah. For us,
abstraction tool. I mean, I'm not
Yeah.
familiar with all the different
Right.
options. I know Citrix had some.
But
File redirection
we're
tool of its
actually
own,
rolling
but-
out a new Citrix farm right now, which will be minuscule in comparison to whatever you guys do. And we have we landed on combination of the Citrix profile and the FS Logic
Yes.
profile. And it works, but sometimes it seems slow. And there could be complicating things, but I just was curious if there's
Yeah.
other.
I don't know the details of exactly what they're gonna wind up with.
Uh-huh.
They have, the complicating factor, they have 15 plus Citrix farms
Yeah.
at different versions of Citrix in those different ones. So it's not a single answer across the board, and that gets to a level of detail that I usually don't deal with.
Yeah. And one of the things that we we have intentionally had out of scope in this project is migrating content from users' network home drives to OneDrive. And there's a couple of reasons for that, but in particular in Citrix, there are some applications that we have that write to people's network home drives that would need to be updated in order to or to use OneDrive.
It's like a game of Tetris.
Yeah. Yep. Very much so. So I've got a few resources up there. We've got the Sync Up podcast from the product team. We've got the support portal and the documentation portal, and then the fast track services. Do you want to talk about what fast track offering is?
Yeah, I can just very briefly, and there's some folks in the room know about Fast Track, I heard, right? But Fast Track is a benefit that's available to Microsoft customers. There is a threshold in terms of seat size that I don't know off the top of my head. But the idea is that there is a Fast Track manager is assigned to our enterprise accounts, and then can bring in specialists who can help with the deployment operations behind different aspects of Microsoft 365.
And for this project, we've been working with a fast track engineer focused on OneDrive. They do have a separate fast track offering around migration that we would take a close look at if we go down that route or when we go down that route. So thank you all very much.